For our COBT viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Brett here with something super special. We have a good friend joining us, Robert Bryce. Robert, this is his third time visiting with us. Robert, we went back and checked the files, so you've joined that elite club of three-time attendees.
Awesome.
We're very lucky to have you. There's always great stuff to talk about, and I know we're going to just get into a whole range of things, Robert. But all of you at home and listening out there, watching, etc., know that Robert is an esteemed author. He's got the Power Hungry podcast. He gives speeches and testifies in front of Congress and is really all over the world talking about power and energy issues. But Robert has recently completed a new docuseries, and it's all about power from many different angles. He looks at it from sort of a transition angle, a nuclear angle, a really interesting, some history on Enron, some developments with the Osage Nation that he can explain to all of us. But it's a great perspective. We got an advanced viewing. I think it's coming out Wednesday. So if you are listening to this or watching this, it is coming out today. But Robert, let me stop talking and say thank you for joining. We're excited to have you as always.
Well, it's a thrill to come back, Maynard. Third time's a charm. And, I've been watching Veriton grow from the very beginning. So great to see your success and have your support on this project. It really is flattering and, I won't say humbling because no one's ever accused me of being humble, but flattering.
Well, you've been a friend from day one, and we really appreciated it, Robert. Mike, you are in Panama. A lot of people don't know this. Mike Bradley grew up in Panama. He's there for a reunion. We're trying to get him to go by and check out that mine that is the source of so much controversy. I don't know if you've squeezed that on, but Mike, you're monitoring the markets from down there. What would you tell us? What would you add in? And give us a little Panamanian flavor today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Maynard. As you can see in the background there, that is the entrance to the Pacific side of the canal. So that's where we are right now. Yacht club and boats are right behind us. So I thought that'd be a real nice treat for today's episode. Anyways, as regard to the markets, today I think there's 3 or 4 things we want to talk about. First of all, tomorrow's a big day because the FOMC meeting, the rate decision from the Fed is tomorrow. And so there's going to be a lot of volatility. Most expectations are the Fed is not going to do anything. They're going to pause, probably going to stay paused until March. Now, the surprise would be if they actually cut rates. I don't think they're going to do that, but it's something to look out for. So watch for some volatility tomorrow. Secondly, in the equity markets, we continue to say this probably for the last few months, low volatility, high sentiment, right? And so we obviously have an FOMC meeting tomorrow. If something crazy comes out of that from Powell's comments, then there could be some big movements in markets. So the markets seem to be really, really frothy. Third, crude oil markets. We're up around $77, $78 on the WTI, and we've had a nice little run here over the last week and a half or so, 2 weeks or thereabouts. And obviously, most of it is Mideast conflict, right? What's the U.S. going to do in response to some of these Iranian attacks? Number one, but number two, the huge surprise came today where Saudi said that they're not going to increase their maximal sustainability, the capacity for production. As you recall, they were going to spend multi-billions of dollars over the next couple of years to take their maximum sustained capacity to around 13 million barrels, up from 12 million. They decided not to do that or put that sort of temporarily on hold. And so, what we're seeing today is some of the reaction to that. As you recall, for the oil services companies, those companies, meaning the big three, people with international offshore exposure, really have done well at the expense of North American companies. That trade seems to be reversing today. You have all of them are down because, some of the spending that everyone would expect over the next 4 or 5 years is going to be coming from Saudi. So the question is, what kind of signal are they sending to the market? Do they think the markets are temporarily oversupplied? Do they think by 2030 there's not going to be enough capacity? You're going to be seeing peak demand? We don't know yet, but huge surprise today. So that's something that we're really keeping our eye on. The last thing I'd say is we're really getting into the thick of earnings report. It's only been mostly oil service, a couple of refiners, but it's going to broaden out across, refiners, E&Ps, service names, alternative energy. So we're really queuing up for it. So far, there's been a really, really good, constructive, long-term dialogue. I think for North American stuff, pricing is pretty stable. Internationally, pricing is getting better. So So far, earnings reports have been really, really good. Like I said, it's going to be broadening out to multi sectors, subsectors over the next couple weeks. So that's what we're keeping an eye on. So with that, Maynard, with the lovely Panama in our background, we'll send it back to you. Awesome.
Well, we're very international today. I'm actually over in Florence. We want to say a special thanks to the Baker Hughes team. They invited us to their Energizing Change 2-day annual meeting, and it's been fascinating. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I've got some questions for Robert, just some of the chatter that's coming out of Europe right now. Rampage. A lot of our viewers don't know that's our nickname for you around the office, but Brett Rampal, seriously, what would you tell us on the nuclear front before we jump in with Robert?
Oh, always fun to be here, Maynard, and always great to see you, Robert. Well, I think the big news in nuclear world kind of today and this week comes from our neighbors to the north out of Canada, where we saw an announcement this week around the Pickering nuclear plant to be refurbished for another several decades of life. This plant generates about 14% of Ontario's electricity. Ontario, sort of one of these clean, emissions-free electricity grid leaders around the world. One of the, sort of the established grids that have made probably the largest strides in kind of reaching true reduced emissions, and mostly on the back of nuclear. And most folks were asking what was going to happen to these plants, to this plant, Pickering, in the next couple of years when it was scheduled to come online. So work by, numerous groups, advocates, others, and the existing experience by OPG and the Canadian nuclear industry, which has proven to be able to deliver these extremely large-scale refurbishment projects, over 10 plus billions of dollars of Canadian investment over a decade plus to deliver these projects under budget, ahead of schedule, and produce massive amount of jobs and continued long-term baseload generation for the provinces of Canada. So it's real fascinating to see this continued trend that is kind of a thesis here that we have at Veritin, that sort of the existing nuclear power plants around the world are going to continue to be more and more seen as this big investment that has already been made and an opportunity to continue investing for the future. So we'll continue to look to Canada to see what else they do and to see what happens to the rest of the Pickering site, because this is only half of the site that they've now announced for refurbishment, and see where they go from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brett. Robert, maybe we jump in right where Brett is leading us a little bit. You've
Sure.
got the docuseries. We need to talk about everything that's in that, including the rollout and buzz that you're already getting around it. But the change that's happened, and it comes up in the docuseries, the change that's happened around nuclear is really stunning. If you go back a few years, like right when we were just getting to know you, we were still closing nuclear plants, and it was inconceivable that we would have the change in attitude that we've had around nuclear. You spent a lot of time in the docuseries talking about nuclear. Do you want to start there and just kind of go off the Pickering news and tell us how you're thinking about nuclear?
Sure, of course. Well, again, thanks for having me. And just to right off the bat, the docuseries is out today. Go to juicetheseries.com. You can also go to Juice the Series on YouTube. The docuseries is out for free. It's a 5-part docuseries. Each episode's about 20 minutes. And Brett's, brief discussion about what's going on in Canada is right on the dot, because the 4th episode in the docuseries is really about how the Canadians are leading the worldwide resurgence and revival of nuclear power. And we have more than 30 on-camera interviews with top thought leaders, and one of them is Chris Kiefer, who, as a unlikely champion for nuclear power, he's an emergency room doctor in Toronto who grew up anti-nuclear, and he changed his mind, changed his outlook. And he really led the pro-nuclear charge in Canada, and didn't do it single-handedly, of course, but he created the Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and they really did change the province of Ontario's view on nuclear, and was he was, I would say, one of the key catalysts in getting this move at Pickering and also the expansion of Bruce Power to happen in Ontario. So yes, that's part of this resurgence of nuclear globally, which obviously the Russia-Ukraine war is part of that. And one of the reasons for that in Europe. But the Canadians right now are the odds-on favorite to be the ones globally to really lead the nuclear renaissance. And they're incredibly well positioned given their design of their reactor. They have the supply chain and they also have the fuel.
And Brett alluded to it, and it comes up a little in the docuseries, of course, but the Canadians seem to be doing it on time and on budget, or I know that's kind of a stretch. And Vogtle, which is in Brett's background, it's only one example, and we'll get better, right, Brett? But what would you say on the economic side? It seems like they are introducing some standardization and an approach which is going to gives you every reason to be optimistic about Canadian nuclear.
Well, and one of the things to be clear, and this is one of the issues that I think is with the difficulty here in the U.S. around new nuclear, is that nuclear, if we're serious about CO2 emissions, and in my view, when our docuseries is about the grid, juice, power politics, and the grid. We're serious about resilience, affordability, reliability. And CO2 emissions, we have to be serious about nuclear energy. But it's going to require robust government involvement. And when you look around the world at the countries where nuclear is succeeding and gaining traction, the government is taking a strong role. China, Russia, France, South Korea, and now Canada. And Ontario Power Generation is partly owned by the Canadian retirement system, if memory serves. So there's been robust government support in Canada for their nuclear sector for a long time. And you also have the labor unions that are very much involved there in Canada to be pro-nuclear. So Canada is taking the lead in many ways because it has the perfect background, perfect history, perfect set of circumstances for it to succeed there. So I'm hopeful for nuclear in the U.S. I want it to succeed, but it's going to be a very slow road, and to get that nuclear capacity built in the U.S. And Vogtle is done, units 3 and 4, unit 3 is online, unit 4 is coming online later this year, but it's been over budget, and we need to improve on that. There's just no doubt about it.
That in your docuseries around nuclear, I thought one of the speakers makes an interesting observation. He says, we make a lot about how long it takes to build nuclear, but it works. And then you have it for an extremely long time. And I think he basically raises the question in the viewers' minds of, are we properly pricing the value of something that lasts 60, 80, 100 years? And so he's almost dismissive of certainly timing, but definitely cost overruns. I thought it was a good point.
Well, and that's the title of our 5th episode. It's called Industrial Cathedrals. And that's, you're talking about Emmett Penny, who has one of the starring roles in the documentary. And he's the editor at Grid Brief, and, just a brilliant, I think a brilliant writer. And I think he's going to write a book on the grid, but he makes this comparison of, cathedrals in Europe. And he went to school in Santa Fe, the cathedral in Santa Fe, and talking about how long it took to build that. And when we look and we walk in that church today, we think, well, we don't wonder how long it took to build. We just marvel at the beauty and the status and this, the way the thing, how beautiful the result is. But that argument, I think, is really important, because overall, the goal in this docuseries is that we make people understand the importance of the electric grid. This is our most important energy network, and all of our other critical systems depend on it. As Chris Kiefer says in the docuseries, he says the electric grid is our civilizational life support system. Well, given that importance, this short-termism that prevails in our markets, and particularly when it comes to electricity, is wrong-headed. We need to be thinking long-term, and that's why thinking about nuclear power as industrial cathedrals, that's Emmett's phrase, is a really good image to think about. We need to be thinking about the long-term focus, long-term needs of our civilization. And so investing a decade or 2 decades in building one of these things seems like a long time. And it's a lot of money, but if they're going to run for 60, 80, or 100 years, it's not so much.
We switch gears a little bit on you. I just wanted to, since Brett had very well. He'd introduced that nuclear thing. I wanted to grab it while we were on it, but pulling back, you talk. Obviously, there's so much here about power, and power is, for all the reasons you point out, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different flavors. There's decision makers. You had Meredith Engwin on, I believe.
Yeah,
she's someone that we had met and found her really interesting. But basically, you illustrate the problems with power, and then you add in, what happens when. I thought one of the fascinating observations is people who want to make money and power love volatility, and so there becomes the docuseries suggests there's sort of an unholy relationship on occasion between the advocates of intermittent power with the advocates of volatility.
Sure.
And they don't really realize what they're doing. But talk a little bit about the power side of this, because that's really I think the thrust of everything, these power systems we're building.
Sure. Just one quick, as you're talking about that, I think one of the key things, and one of the things that I'm proud of in the film, is we talk about the grid, right? You try to explain what this system is, what this network of networks is. And it's not easy to understand, and it's also a very diffused system in the United States, where we have more than 3,000 different electricity providers in America, right? We have the cooperatives, eight or 900 of them. We have 2,000 publicly owned utilities, like I live in Austin Energy, the investor-owned utilities like Duke and the others. And then, of course, the TVA and Bonneville and the rest of the federal power agencies. So that's one of the complexities. But the other part that I think is critical for people in the U.S. and around the world to understand is a lot of what we're seeing for instance, in Texas and in California is the legacy of Enron. And to me, this is remarkable because, I published my first book. Now I've written 6 books. My first book was called Pipe Dreams. I published it 22 years ago. It was about Enron. Pipe Dreams, Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron. Well, who pioneered this idea of the restructured market, as Ken Lay called it? We're restructuring of Texas markets, the deregulation of electricity, this idea of electricity as a commodity instead of a service. That's Enron. So the legacy of this one company and the ideas that they pushed and succeeded in pushing in California and Texas and now in many markets around the U.S. is still very much with us today. And it's one of the reasons I would argue that our grid has become weakened. It's because of this short-termism, this idea of electricity as a commodity instead of a service. This is a direct result of how Enron approached their business and how their ideas around the electric grid were adopted all across the country, including improbably in California, and then Texas copied California. And now the Texas grid today is looking a lot like California's grid with the duck curve and everything else, with all this influx of wind and solar. So it's remarkable in terms of a historical context to think about the evolution of energy and power markets and how still today, now 22, 23 years after Enron's bankruptcy, the legacy of Enron still lives.
It's also interesting. I feel like you point out that you paint the picture in the docuseries of the old way of doing things, the regulated utility. Yes, they overspent, and then they got a return. That we know the incentives, but the other incentive was, the power always worked. And then this Enron type thinking entered the system. It seemed like also what's fascinating is when we started doing all this market-based thinking, legislatures and politicians had to set the rules around the markets. So ironically, what began as a market-based reforms got government more involved, tinkering with all the little flavors. And that really set us on a course for political people making almost engineering decisions, if you will. Is that how you think about what happened here?
Yes, absolutely. And instead of engineers making the decisions, it's a bunch of lawyers. And, my line about lawyers are, why are they lawyers? Because they couldn't do the math to get into engineering school. So,
now see, we're going to get a bunch of hate mail from lawyers now, Robert. You shouldn't say that.
Oh, darn it. That's too bad. But I say that as a joke, but there's a lot of truth in that. Our grid now, the way it was designed, the rules of the road in the marketplace weren't written by engineers; they were written by lawyers. And so the policy around this idea of electricity as a commodity, and you're right, that now the market has become so complex. And this idea, it's a market. And after Winter Storm Uri, which is the real reason why I did this docuseries, I didn't want to do another documentary. But after I got blacked out here in Austin for 48 hours, I thought, well, without sounding too grandiose about it, I was called to make this project. I was called to do it. And so we did it. And I'm really proud that we did. But the fundamental problem here is this misapprehension or misunderstanding of what electricity is, and that we can just let the market decide. No, damn it, wrong. No, absolutely not. It's a service, not a commodity. And we've gone away from this monopoly model, which a lot of people don't like, and I understand why, but now no one's responsible for reliability. And that's a real problem. And FERC and NERC and the RTOs are all they're warning us about this, and we need to heed those warnings.
Do you think we're I myself feel a little guilty of it. We're almost romanticizing the regulated power era because it, upon further reflection, it does seem like, gosh, we just didn't have the reliability problems, and we might have been paying more than we needed to, but it wasn't jumping out at us that it was so expensive. Like, are we looking back too fondly and forgetting some of the problems? That's a question I ask myself.
Well, and that's a really good question, Maynard, and I think it's the right way to frame it. And I'll answer by quoting Meredith Angwin, who, in fact, is on the Power Hungry podcast this week, to kind of, her 6th appearance on the podcast, because I admire her thinking about this so much.
Well, if anyone is worth 6 appearances, it's Meredith Angwin.
She's remarkable. This a 77-year-old grandmother in rural Vermont self-publishes a book on the grid and becomes a national expert and a recognized expert. But her great line is, she says about this idea of monopoly, she says, I'm quoting her almost directly. She says, people accuse me of you just favor monopolies. And she said, no, I favor accountability. And therein lies the problem. That after Winter Storm Uri, remember, and even after Winter Storm Elliott, everyone's looking around, well, who's responsible? Will the market fail? Well, who made the market? A bunch of lawyers. Well, okay, well, who's responsible? Well, no one's responsible. And this is one of the key challenges, I think, and it's a big one as we think about the U.S. grid and where we are with how diffused it is. You've got the 50 different public utility commissions across the country. You've got the RTOs, and you have all these different entities. Well, who's going to be responsible for reliability? Because we've had very serious warnings about potential grid failures, and massive ones. And Winter Storm Uri was the obvious one now 3 years ago. So, yes, I don't want to romanticize the benefits of monopolies, but at least the buck stopped somewhere.
No, it's a great point. Mike?
Yeah, Robert, always a pleasure to have you on the show for sure. Maynard mentioned earlier, I'm in Panama, and, one of the big events here was the Cobre mine being shut down. And that really kind of made me start to think about what I want to talk to you about today. It's like, unforeseen things can happen. This is not easy stuff. Permitting issues, rules issues, regulatory issues, they loom large. Yeah. I start to think right now, as we had this, LNG this last week with permitting delays from the Biden administration. Yeah. And I just think about what you talked about earlier about just education of the consumer. Maybe talk about your thoughts of permitting, just education. Are we making any strides forward? What are some of the, obstacles we face on that from both the state and local level? Anything you can touch on that would be great.
Sure. Well, it's a really good question, Michael, because this is something where I've been living for a long time. And it's one of the points we make in the film is about land use conflicts. And one of the episodes of which I'm most proud is episode 3, because we delve into the land use conflicts in Osage County, Oklahoma. And I have deep roots in Oklahoma. My great uncle was a member of the Osage tribe. He was born and raised in Fairfax, Oklahoma in 1909, and had a front row seat to the Reign of Terror in the 1920s. And that Reign of Terror, the Killers of the Flower Moon, that same story played out in Osage County, Oklahoma, when Enel came in and built 84 wind turbines in Osage County and illegally mined the Osage tribe's mineral estate. Well, that's a land use conflict, right? And that is one of the issues around these ideas of renewables. Oh, we're going to switch the grid and we're going to run it all on wind and solar and batteries and, fairy dust. No, you're not, because there's not enough land in rural America, and all across rural America. Now, the number of rejections or restrictions is over 600 now for solar and wind across the country, because local communities are saying, we don't want this. And the same kinds of land use conflicts around the siting of the projects themselves is happening with transmission projects. So just a few days ago, the San Carlos Apache and the Tohono O'odham tribes sued the Bureau of Land Management in federal court, alleging that they illegally approved a transmission project in Arizona. So, these ideas around energy policy and land use policy are two sides of the same coin. They are directly related. And so how we deal with permitting, how we deal with transmission, how we deal with siting. All of these are the key friction points all around the electric grid in America. And there is no easy solution to them. And these permitting battles, I was just reading one about the Cardinal Hickory transmission line, something like 98% built, and they can't finish the last part of it because it goes across, I think it's a federal wildlife refuge or a national park. So these land use issues and permitting, these are the key issues facing the grid. And I think the way I put it is the electric grid we have is largely the grid we're going to have.
Or maybe I could just add on something to Mike before jump to Brett, and that's, I think you're making the point, maybe you may mean to make this or you may not mean to make this. I just want to understand it a little better. We tend to think of permitting issues as they apply to all flavors. It could be a pipeline, it could be a windmill, it could be solar, nuclear, it could be a bridge, it could be anything. It's impossible to build stuff in the country and in the West. That just seems like a problem.
Right.
But you're kind of putting a finer point on, if we're going to solve power problems, we may have more permitting challenges with land intensive approaches like solar in particular, but I suppose also wind. We may have more issues permitting those locally than we would have, if you put up a natural gas plant or certainly a nuclear plant. Those are denser forms of energy that, once you do it one time, you get more energy. Is that where you're kind of headed with your comment?
Absolutely. I mean, it hits the nail right on the head, Maynard, that we're going to have to use as much of the existing infrastructure as we can. That includes the existing pipeline network, but also in particular, the high voltage transmission network. There are these claims, and they've come out of Princeton, they come out of Stanford, they come out of Cal Berkeley, some of the most prestigious schools in the world. Oh, we'll just double or triple the size of the high voltage transmission lines or the high voltage transmission grid in the US. And I sit there and I look at it and I think, the hell you will. There is no way it's going to happen. I mean, if you think it's difficult to build a pipeline and put it 5 or 6 feet under the ground, imagine how difficult it is to put it 200 feet in the air. And so that's what we see in high voltage transmission. And we're only building, I have the latest numbers. I think since 2008, I just got the latest numbers from C3 Group. We're only adding about 1,500 or 1,600 miles a year. And a lot of that's being built just in Texas. So the amount of interstate high voltage transmission that's being built is a fraction of that 1,700 mile number. So, this is a very difficult, building infrastructure of any kind is more and more difficult. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm very clear about, if we're going to be serious about CO2 emissions, we have to be serious about nuclear, because we can put those nuclear plants with a small footprint because of their high power density at existing coal plants, existing gas plants, and use the existing infrastructure. And that's going to be key.
Yeah, it's so great to see you again and chat with you. And it was so great to check out the docuseries and see so many, friends, and see the stories and trends around nuclear energy so prominently focused upon, and kind of taking two sort of things that, that what kind of Maynard was asking around and kind of a little bit around what you responded. It does seem, not just in this country, but everywhere, that it's hard to just build anything anywhere right now. And, nuclear energy is certainly no, poster child for that anywhere to look at, except possibly China, which is, not the most, and, copyable or place we should be envying at this point, just because they're building, nuclear power plants successfully. You touched on a lot of action for sort of the government, and, many may point to and say, government actions have been stalled, or government bipartisan support for nuclear energy is really high compared to kind of the other actions we work on. A lot of your docuseries also even focused on sort of the public perception side and the public response and reception to nuclear energy. And even some of your participants would say it's never been higher, and it's so in a world where, maybe this is as good as we get, government support. Are there, sort of business models and sort of, is there a third leg here, or something that you've seen besides just, sort of this demand sort of signal that we need more nuclear that could help sort of drive or push more to see that sort of change you want?
Well, that's a good question. And let me be clear. The U.S., there are three main obstacles to new nuclear in the U.S., and that's regulation, capital, and fuel. And they all have to be solved, and they all have to be solved in fairly short order. And further, we are already seeing the shakeout in the startup sector, in the nuclear sector in the U.S. with NuScale Power. They lost the contract at UAMPS. So this is not going to be an easy move toward new nuclear in the United States. I think the Europeans and the Canadians, as we talked about before, are going to be the ones that are more motivated to make this happen and make it happen more quickly. And one of the reasons for that is I haven't checked Henry Hub today, but what Natty in the US is $2.50, something like that. I mean, it's still incredibly cheap. And so in Europe, it's $8, $9. So there's a more price pressure in Europe for Europe to adopt new nuclear than there is in the US. I think the regulatory scheme may be a little easier there because their respective governments are going to be more aligned with the need and the understanding for new nuclear. Whether it's Czech Republic or Romania or Poland, for instance, were the ones that are obvious examples of where new nuclear will be built in Europe over the next few years. But there are a host of challenges that have to be overcome. And one of them is the fuel cycle, because Russia, 25%, Brett, as you know, 25% of the nuclear fuel in the U.S. today is still coming from the Russians. So we're going to need long-term bipartisan decadal support for nuclear in the United States. And that's not an easy political lift.
But what's interesting, that's a great way to put it, long-term bipartisan decadal support. I think what we're struck by is nuclear. It could be Democrats, it could be Republicans, it could be business people, it could be environmental people. Occasionally, it's even a Hollywood person. It's stunning the number of groups it can unite that are otherwise not unitable.
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive.
Well, and I think that, and I think that there is a generational shift. And that's one of the things with the new docuseries, Juice, Power, Politics, and the Grid, juicetheseries.com. One of the things we are very happy about was bringing in younger people, right? There's a generational difference, right? I'm 63. I'm an old guy, right? When I grew up, there were bomb shelters and the radiation symbols, and we grew up under this specter of nuclear war. And that was the environment that we were used to, right? To fear nuclear, fear fission, fear the idea of nuclear anything. Today, the younger generation didn't grow up with that, and what they're concerned about, many of them, is climate change. So, Maddie Hilly is one of the people in the film. Mark Nelson, Emmett Penny, Chris Kiefer's a generation younger than I am. These are younger people. Paris Ortiz Wines, Isabel Bomeke. These are people who are in the younger generation, and they're looking at climate changes and looking at nuclear and saying this is something we have to do. And so they're coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, a fresh political perspective that I think is absolutely critical. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that really makes me hopeful that, in fact, we will see a maturation of nuclear both here in the U.S. and around the world. But we need to get on with it. And that's the key point of our last episode, where we talk about industrial cathedrals. We have to commit and we have to build. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be cheap.
So let's, this permitting thing that you guys were on, I guess Mike mentioned it. The administration in the U.S. last Friday announced that they were going to be slowing permitting, thinking about the climate effects of new permits. And it was widely perceived as something that was done because there's a part of the environmental movement that wants to see that type of announcement. And so it was perceived as appealing to that community. That community, it seemed that's the community that really is opposed to building anything.
Yeah. And particularly opposed to nuclear energy.
Yeah. So what do you notice about, you spend time, all over talking to people about energy issues, energy policy. You go to Washington, you have conversations, offline. What do you think? Where is the state of all this, Robert? Are people starting to understand that just blocking stuff in the West, how is this possibly helping the climate or anything else? What's the state of that?
It's interesting you bring that up because when as you're talking about that, so I read the White House press release on quoting the different groups that were cheering on the ban or the slow walking of the LNG permits. And one of the quotes was from someone from the Center for Biological Diversity. Okay, well, so that's interesting. Well, who was involved with the lawsuit against the high voltage transmission line in Arizona that they now want to block that would allow wind energy from New Mexico to go into southern Arizona and then potentially onto California? The Center for Biological Diversity. So they're opposed to transmission for renewable energy or for wind energy. I don't call it renewable. They're opposed to high voltage transmission for alternative energy, and they're opposed to LNG exports. Well, what are you for? So I think this is one of the things that, and we talk about it a little bit in the docuseries, but I write a lot about it on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, is the anti-industry industry. I mean, and I did a little quick tabulation of all the groups that were quoted in the White House press release: Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, League of Conservation Voters, Center for American Progress. Their combined budgets, total of their budgets of those, it's like 12 or 15 groups, over $1 billion a year. These are incredibly powerful entities that have enormous budgets. And so they are going to do whatever gets their name in the headlines. They're going to do whatever they think is required to raise more money. So this anti-industry industry, as opposed to hydrocarbons, opposed to nuclear, and they're very powerful. And that's going to be a key obstacle to good energy policy. And it's going to continue regardless of what happens in November. And they're going to stick around.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, the anti-industry industry. Maybe if we toggle back to just power. One thing I think is, and I mentioned, we're in Europe, the European energy conversation, given security issues, given gas dependence, given sort of heightened focus on climate solutions, et cetera, it's always unique to hear them. It seems like the one of the problems from just the voting public's perspective is, if wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy when they're running, right? This is the problem. Then if you continue to add wind and solar, you should be making, if you keep adding sugar, things should get sweeter. So if you keep adding something that's cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, things should be getting cheaper. But they're not getting cheaper. They're getting more expensive, and they're getting less reliable. How is this piece of the puzzle ever going to get explained so that we can slow down and think about the best way to build good energy systems?
Well, that's a great point. And I'll quote John Constable, who's works for Net Zero Watch in Europe or in England, and he's pointing out he has a line in the docuseries where he's speaking to the United States. He says, "Look, you see what's happening in Europe. You've been warned. Don't do what's happening in Europe." And Germany is the obvious example where their economy has now fallen into recession. Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, so the slowdown in Germany is going to affect all of Europe. And Germany has wasted, and that is the right word, foolishly wasted over $1 trillion on this energy Wende disaster by thinking they can run their entire economy on wind and solar. And now they're finding out, oh, that was a big mistake. And so now what are they doing? They're reopening lignite plants. I mean, this is I think it's the Garzweiler mine, which, I mean, you couldn't make this up. I mean, in terms of, if you wrote it in a novel, you wouldn't believe it. They're taking down a wind project in this part of Germany next to the Garzweiler lignite mine so they can expand the lignite mine because they don't have enough electricity. So, I mean, you wouldn't believe it if you made that story, you made it up in some kind of fictional narrative. But in fact, that's the reality. And what is Germany doing? Energy sanity, energy realism is prevailing to a certain extent, and they're keeping their lignite-fired power plants open. So Germany and the rest of Europe, and England in particular, are providing a stark warning to the United States about what not to do. And unfortunately, this administration, and I don't say this as a partisan, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I am disgusted, but they seem to think that the European model is the one we should follow. And you don't even have to look to Europe, just look to California. And we talk about that at length in the third episode, Green Dreams. about how power prices in California have gone up 3 times faster than those in the rest of the U.S. since Schwarzenegger signed his renewable energy mandate in 2008. So we have the warning signs, Maynard. They're very clear about what is happening. And yet we have a lot of policymakers at local and state and federal levels who are saying, oh, never mind, climate change, climate change, climate change.
So one of the things that you mentioned, you hear the warnings from NERC, you hear the RTOs talking about it, like it is well established in the power community that people are getting worried about a potential system failure.
Yeah.
A significant one. The first segment of your docuseries is about what happened in Texas. It's honestly just terrifying, to think about in weather of that kind, and then you lose power. So do you feel like how probable is it, do you think we have a big power failure in the next year or two? Just given the course we're on, I know that's hard to put you on the spot like that, but if that were to happen, well, part of why I ask is just out of public concern, but the other reason I ask is that would really crystallize people's thinking, perhaps the voters, on what we're doing. But what do you think about that? Is that an overstated risk, or is that a real risk, or how bad is it?
Well, it is not an overstated risk. And in fact, when you look at the recent reports from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, and also testimony from the FERC commissioners, Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioners, in front of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee last May, Commissioner James Danley, who's now retired or was off of the commission, he and several other commissioners they effectively said, and I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly, they're saying we are facing a reliability crisis in the electric grid in the United States. And that's their words. NERC, in their recent report, I think it was last August, identified policy as a reliability risk. I mean, for the first time ever, they're pointing to policymakers and saying, all this policy you're making is an enormous risk to the reliability of the grid. And 2 other quick points. Yes, Winter Storm Uri here in Texas, the grid was within 4 or 5 minutes of complete failure. And if that system had failed during that time, now 3 years ago, when, it was below freezing, and it was below freezing for days, we would have had a mass casualty event. Tens of thousands of people would have died. But there's even a more recent event, which was Winter Storm Elliott, when New York City almost lost gas supply into Manhattan and the rest of New York City. Had that happened again, it would have been a catastrophic event. So we take these energy and power networks that we have for granted, but we do so at our extreme peril. And so that's one of the main reasons why I made this docuseries. I'm not looking to make a lot of money. We got paid to make the film. We're giving it away for free. We want people to understand what is at risk, and the risks are enormous.
One of the concerns I have is just the grid is not growing as fast as you like. Permitting is very, very slow, but yet AI is ramping up quite significantly.
Yeah.
You hear utilities talking about going from 0 to 1% growth over the last 20 years to 5, even 10% growth over the next 4 or 5 years. How of a big of a concern is that for you right now? It's just the timing is really bad timing, given where the grid is currently. Maybe some thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I'd respond, Michael, that that it's going to be very localized, right? So some states are seeing no electric demand growth at all. Texas is seeing a lot of demand growth. California demand growth has been flat. There's been no demand growth in California for a decade or more. So it's going to be very much regional in terms of where that demand growth happens. On the AI and data center front, it's going to be, look at Data Center Alley, near Dulles Airport in Virginia. That's going, their demand growth there for, we're talking gigawatt scale demand for new power that is for data centers that are scheduled to come online there. And Dominion Energy saying, well, we can't serve all this new load. We got to figure something else out. So yes. And then, to what extent electric vehicles are going to add load, the electrify everything push, which I think is just crazy because it's getting the cart ahead of the horse. We need a diversified electric system. We need a diversified power system, and putting all of our demand on the grid, both for heating, for transportation, for cooling, all this I think is a security risk. So you're right. I mean, we are, and there have been recent reports, pointing out this, expected demand growth, whether it's data centers or, heat pumps, the electrify everything push, is going to put more and more demand on an electric grid that is already struggling to keep up with existing demand. So this is a real problem.
Robert, you talked about, probably what I'm going to call later on, the three pillars of Bryce around sort of nuclear. I think you said fuel, financing, and oh God, I just had it on the tip of my tongue.
Regulation.
Thank you.
Fuel.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Predominantly a lot of folks see those issues and look at those issues and they see them really as federal issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking, when we look at a place like Texas where you live, and we've been talking about winter storms and the challenges with the grid that have been there, this is a place that, as you even mentioned earlier, is one of the few places in the country that is actually building transmission and can do some, has experience doing projects and has load growth and everything. And, what outside of these sort of traditionally federal issues and everything like that, is there anything else besides, sort of those market drivers that you have mentioned before around everybody needs to think more, sort of
Sure.
about around accountability? Is there anything else that you think the state could do to either entice nuclear or fix, kind of, create that field of dreams? If you build it, they will come around, sort of bringing in the industry.
Well, that's a good point, Brett. And you've been on the Power Hungry podcast, so we even talked about this before. And I think it was a point you made that, in fact, it may be industry that leads and not government. It may be industry that leads and not utilities, because, and you look at the potential deal or the deal that's been announced between X Energy and Dow, that Dow wants to build SMRs, the X Energy's high temperature gas reactors at their chemical plant in Seadrift near Corpus Christi. And maybe Dow uses all of that power and all of that industrial heat for their own purposes and don't feed it into ERCOT. Now that's a real possibility. So you have the industrial applications for mining, chemicals, refining, et cetera, that are one real potential market for the small modular reactors. The other is in AI and data centers, and that you saw Microsoft just hired their own nuclear guy, right, to explore this possibility. And this is one of the key limiters. As I've tracked the high tech sector's power demand for a long time. I wrote about it in my last book. Their electricity demands, particularly for AI, are just enormous, and the potential growth there is just enormous. And I think they're realizing we can't do it with renewables. No way. We don't have enough gas pipelines to build the amount of infrastructure we need or the power gen that we need. So that may well be where SMRs are able to make get purchase in the marketplace, because they can have industrial customers who are saying, we'll manage all the offtake ourselves. But it still doesn't, even if that's the case, it still doesn't overcome the regulatory issues at NRC. The capital maybe gets solved, but then they still have to get the fuel. And when it comes to high assay, low enriched uranium, which is a lot of these SMRs are going to need, that's another, again, takes us back to Russia one more time.
It sort of seems like in that situation, if we solve the regulatory and if we solve the fuel, then the capital would say, all right, I'm in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the regulatory part is the key one. And there's some positive news there. And just in the last few days, the Biden administration withdrew the nomination of Jeff Barron to the NRC. And Barron was an anti-nuclear member of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And, I'm sure Brett followed this, but Breakthrough Institute and several others said, we don't want this guy on the commission. He's not in favor of new nuclear. Why do you have him on the commission? So, I do think there is progress at the NRC, and that's very hopeful. But we need more of it, and we need it quicker, and we need to get this permitting and regulatory thing sorted out. I mentioned NuScale before, just to underscore that point. It costs NuScale $500 million in direct payments to the NRC to get their approval for their reactor. That's just an insane amount of money. Now, Kairos got a recent approval. I don't think they had to spend that much money, but still, $500 million in 6 years, that's just crazy town.
Yeah, sorry, not to, kind of jump in here a little bit, but just a flag for you, Robert, because I agree, the regulatory burden is dramatic and it needs to change, and but I believe the quote that NuScale makes around that $500 million is that's how much they spent, including the fees and in their design application. I believe their direct fee payments to the NRC were more on the order of like 50 million out of all of that. Still a staggering amount of money in everything that we're talking about, and a dramatic amount for a first of a kind project and for first of a kind developers. But just I think they include the 50 within the 500 that they used to get to be able to do that regulatory engagement.
Fair enough. If I can just jump back to the point that we were discussing just a minute ago, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, is the idea of we live in a world that's a system of systems, right? They're interconnected, interdependent. And this idea that we're going to make dramatic expansions to the electric grid, well, hold on there. How are you going to do this? Because already, and I spend a lot of time in rural America, I talk to cooperatives all the time. In fact, Matt Brandrup from Rural Electric Supply Cooperative sent me some new figures the other day, pointing out the inflation rates for utility products up nearly 50% in the last 3 years alone for all of the different types of utility products, whether it's transformers, conductors, et cetera. So you have this inflation in the stuff, right? The kit that's needed to build the grid and to keep the existing grid running and running smooth. And then you have the labor issue. And this is another thing that I find in rural America, talking to cooperatives, there aren't enough linemen. So even in a perfect world, Michael, if, we need 2 gigawatts of this and that, we're going to need it over here. Well, it doesn't mean you have enough transformers, because there's been a nationwide shortage of transformers. The Department of Energy has proposed some draconian new rules on efficiency that could very well corrupt and distort the entire transformer production system in America. But then we don't have enough skilled laborers who are able to do the work. So there are constraints on the system as a system to be able to expand at any kind of rate that beyond the rate that it's expanding now. And it's labor, it's capital, it's also just the stuff itself.
It seems like, Robert, if you thought about giving guidance from a federal level, or leaning into this from a federal level and trying to real problems in the near term and do better planning for the long term, one of the things you do in the near term, it seems like, is you'd say, please, we're not going to close any existing plants. Like, we need to keep all the existing stuff up and running.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we've talked a little bit on the show about coal plants being closed or being put out of commission, et cetera. Do you have any visibility on existing plants that are closing and how we could delay that?
Well, this is a really critical point, and I think it was. I'm trying to remember the CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute. She made this point a while back. Maria Korsnick, thank you. She's been on the Power Hungry podcast, but recently she said, "Well, you need to keep your coal plants open. You're going to need them for reliability." And I'm fully in agreement with that. We need to keep the existing coal plants open until we can replace them potentially with nuclear, but that's going to be a while. And so what we've seen, in fact, just in the last few weeks, Maynard, is that PJM, the grid operator in the Eastern U.S., has told the owner, Talon Energy, a Houston-based company, they don't want them to close their coal-fired power plant in Maryland because it would cause reliability problems in the area around Baltimore. So we've heard these warnings from the different RTOs, including MISO, and more broadly from FERC and NERC, saying we're closing too much thermal generation and we're not replacing it with reliable forms of generation. But I want to make one other key point, and it's a point that we make in the docuseries, is that this anti-industry, the Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, the League of Conservation Voters, other groups, they have effectively unlimited amounts of money. And their latest one of their latest installments is $500 million donation from Michael Bloomberg, whose stated goal, the quote in the press release from Michael Bloomberg, is, we want to close all the remaining coal plants in America and half of the gas plants by 2030. That's 40% of all the generation in America. So, I mean, these are draconian kinds of objectives, and they're not being questioned. And this is frankly, from an unaccountable group of NGOs who don't have to deliver molecules or electrons, and they only have to pass this policy, and they're being backed by one of the richest men in the world. I mean, We talked about government policy, but here we have a real threat to reliability coming from the NGO sector, and I don't think people are taking it quite seriously enough.
Well, and it's one of those things where I suppose certain people are just going to have certain views, but it seems like one of those things where if we really at a leadership level said, this is how much power we have, this is how much we're using, this is the growth in power, these are the ways we get power, this is how long it takes to add, like we could very thoughtfully lay out, this is probably something a president needs to do. We could very thoughtfully lay out how this system works and why we can't do those things. And I honestly feel like if there's a lot of smart people that give to those organizations, if they knew, understood, and this is part of what the docuseries is trying to help with, but if people understood these problems, particularly consumers, they would say, well, hold on, stop, wait a minute.
Right.
Don't do that. We got to get more voices in the discussion, and we need better leadership is obviously what it feels like.
Well, absolutely. I completely agree. But one of the other key problems here, and we've talked around this, but all of these regulations, in fact, I was in Bismarck, North Dakota last week. I spoke at the EPIC conference up there. And when I was there, they said, oh, by the way, the Sierra Club has sued Basin Electric. Well, that's one of the cooperatives that owns a coal plant. Well, so when you have all this regulatory uncertainty from this administration, right, the GHG rule that the EPA has proposed, you're creating a lot of uncertainty for investors. And as I don't have to tell you, you're investment banking guys, investors hate uncertainty. They want to know what's going to happen with regulations. They want to know what's going to happen in the market. And what we're seeing with the litigation coming from the NGOs, from the uncertainty from the EPA on greenhouse gases, et cetera. This is a very uncertain environment for utilities, co-ops, investor-owned utilities alike, all trying to figure out where should they be investing their money, and they don't know what to do because there is so much uncertainty. So, but to get back to the key point here is, it's why I did the docuseries. We have to be focused on the importance of this electric system that we have. It is fundamental to our society, and we're taking it largely for granted, and it's being monkeyed with by a lot of people, a lot of policymakers on the edges, without any understanding of what the ultimate reliability problems can be. And you don't have to question the reliability problem. Hell, just look at Generac and look at the sales of standby generators. And consumers are looking at this and realizing the grid is not as reliable as it should be.
I mean, not to be simplistic, Robert, but don't you think the way we've approached these grids is with decarbonization first and foremost in our minds, and we've pushed other things, cost, reliability, we pushed that aside, and we've made progress on the decarbonization side, but we have lost sight of the really important other side of this. And that's really happened across, it seems like, the Western world. That's sort of been the problem. Is that fair?
No, I completely agree.
We don't have balanced priorities.
Exactly. And the way I reply,
and it's debatable. It's debatable. These are everybody would like to do what we can around climate, but it's debatable of what some of this accomplishes. Like when you said the Germans then reopen a lignite mine because they have problems. Like you can quickly undo a lot of progress with one, surge in need of power.
Sure. Well, and that's it. And, people ask me about my view on climate change. Okay, yes, climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern. And we have to balance the action we take on climate with all of the other issues that we face in society, including affordability, reliability, resilience, health of industry. And, when you were saying that, Maynard, I just thought of, again, quoting Meredith Angwin, who, we can form our fan club for Meredith and her book, Shorting the Grid. But one of the points she made during the Power Hungry podcast just the other day was she said that, I'm quoting her directly, she said, facts are finally intruding on the narrative about decarbonization in the electric grid. And I think that that's right, that facts are starting to intrude on this narrative. But don't forget, they're still, I mean, let's call them, and I think it's the right word, zealots around this issue. And I think that we saw them there, the effect of this, climate only focus in the Biden administration's move on the LNG permits. But we're seeing it as well from this group called Beyond Carbon that Michael Bloomberg is giving $500 million to, bring his total funding to that group to $1.1 billion. And their goal is, I think that, to put it very plainly, the destabilization of the American electric grid. It's a very dangerous goal.
Robert, we're going to run out of time with you. We always enjoy it. You know that. Tell us a little bit about the rollout of the docuseries, where it'll be showing, the publicity. I know you've had some interviews, etc. We sure appreciate you, visiting with us on the day of the launch. That's pretty cool.
It is.
But tell us about it. Tell us about the rollout.
Good. Well, thanks. Well, you've been a supporter, Maynard, and it's just been, flattering and just awesome to have you, helping us, and the folks at Veriton as well. And Tammy's been great, and, always a fan of Michael and his work, and to be able to talk to Brett again. The easiest way to find more about the film is go to juicetheseries.com. That's our website. It's available for free on YouTube. It's going to stay free. We're not going to start charging. It's a 5-part docuseries. Each episode is about 5 minutes. There are 5 episodes. The first is called Texas Meltdown. The second is Undermined by Enron. The third one is called Green Dreams. I will say it's my favorite because it's about the Osage tribe and their fight against Enel in the longest running legal battle against wind energy in American history. And last month, the Osage tribe kicked Enel's butt in federal court, and the federal court judge ordered the removal of 84 turbines that Enel built on Osage's traditional land. Fourth episode is Nuclear Renaissance. The fifth episode is Industrial Cathedrals. I'm really excited about the project. My colleague Tyson Culver directed it. He did just a fantastic job in putting it all together. I mean, fantastic. We have original animations, original score, more than 30 interviews. JuiceTheSeries.com. You can find it on YouTube at Juice the Series. If you lose any of that, you can find it on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. And
you've got some showings coming up, and you're doing some interviews. Are we going to see you on The View, Robert?
Well, that would be good. I haven't been hanging out with the girls lately on TV, but yeah, I'm hoping to get some TV coverage. We're working with the group out of Washington to get as much press on this because we want to change the conversation. That's our goal. This is a project we took on because we felt called to do it. And so we need to focus on the grid. We need to focus on the vulnerabilities, the fragility, and how we make it more robust and more resilient.
And are you hearing, you think Washington people are going to be interested in this? Do you think you're anticipating some more policy conversation?
I hope so. We're doing a screening, in fact, in Washington, D.C. on February 26th. We have one in 2 weeks, in fact, at SMU in Dallas. We're screening it in Tulsa, my hometown, on the 15th. On the 16th, we're screening it in Gray Horse, Oklahoma, which is a community center in the middle of the traditional Osage reservation. My friends from the Osage tribe are going to come there, and we, again, I'm really proud of that episode. We're hoping to do one in Houston, and then we have one, of course, in DC, and then we may well have some other screenings around the country. But right now, we're really looking to get this out nationally, and to everyone who's listening to this, anything you can do to share it, tell people about it. We want millions of views on this on our docuseries. That's our goal. We want to get people to watch it, to react to it, share it. That's our goal.
Well, and it's interesting, Robert, as we wrap up, I think everybody does owe you a thank you here, because even if people disagree with certain things or certain aspects or just have different priorities, the fact that we have a power system that is increasingly unreliable and could lead to some very bad things, on top of we have power growth, as Mike mentioned, like, we have a problem. So it is time for a national town hall meeting before this thing gets worse. And so by pointing it out, I think that's just a huge service to all of us. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. I'm doing my best, Maynard. This is my purpose and my passion. And what else am I going to do? I don't play golf. Golf sucks. So this is what I do. So flattered to come on again on the podcast and talk about these things. JuiceTheSeries.com. Did I mention JuiceTheSeries.com?
You're very good at that. I mean, it's like you just put that. You're like the subliminal man from Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
Sprinkle it in there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Robert. Thanks to everybody out there listening and watching. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.